once more, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this panel, Africa at the Center of IOC's Energy Transition Strategy. My name is Verner Ayukegba. I'm a Senior Vice President with the African Energy Chamber, and I will be moderating this panel this morning. We have an esteemed panel which has been in the sector. They might look young, but I know all of them very well, and they've been in the sector for a couple of years now. We have Dr. Gadji, Managing Director of Korea Energy and Oil Exploration and Production Company. We have Chinan Dikwa, who's Head of Energy Transition at KBR. We have my good friend Vladimir Ilyanin, who's Deputy Managing Director with Gazprom. And we have, of course, Heiner Melkevik. Heiner has been with one of the IOCs. I mean, he's no more there, but just recently was Managing Director for Equinor in Nigeria. And Equinor is one of those companies, whenever you talk about energy transition, this is one of the first names that comes to mind is always Equinor. So it would be interesting to listen to all of you guys with respect to, what Africa is facing in terms of energy transition and what your thoughts are around this topic. We have, over the past couple of days, listened to a whole number of panels, and one of the key things that has always come up is energy transition and the question of how we're going to deal with it. On the one side, there are those who want to ignore it totally. On the other side, there are those who are saying it might not be your making, but it's certainly that gorilla in the room which you cannot ignore. So how is it that the continent, how is it that individual countries, how is it that individual companies, in that sense, are going to respond to energy transition in a manner that keeps them productive, profitable, and doesn't get them out of business? For the chamber, just shortly on this, we strongly believe that energy transition has to be adapted to the realities of the African countries on this continent. You cannot transition in Luanda, in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Rwanda in the same way you transition in Stockholm or in London or in New York. And so for us, it is certainly something which we strongly advocate for. I don't know any African who hates his planet, who wants to kill the planet in that sense. All we are saying is, or advocating for, is a transition that marries and mirrors the realities of the industry and of the continent in that sense. So without much further ado, I would allow my panel to introduce themselves and to certainly say something with respect to transition from where they stand and their viewpoint before I go into questions, and also take questions from the audience. Yes, let's start with you, Hai.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. So my name is, I'll give a very short introduction to myself and why I'm sitting here and why I'm very happy to sit here. So I spent around 15 years with Equinor, which used to be called Statoil, and I remember when Tinipere Silva was introducing me at one conference, Minister of State for Petroleum in Nigeria a few years ago. He said, Equinor, the company that's so environmentally friendly, they changed its name from Statoil to Equinor. And I think, jokes aside, I think, but I think it was actually a good point, in the sense that the IOCs and certainly, the European IOCs have been very much in the forefront. Now I'm talking macro level, in terms of seeing the trend that is the energy transition, which is a buzzword, but it is also about how do you address your portfolio and your future, let's say, standing in the capital markets, and how do you attract talent, et cetera, et cetera. So that is a reality for the IOCs. And I think, unfortunately, on that, many there is a trend that some of those IOCs are pulling out of jurisdictions that they find to not be so supportive of their transition. So a point was made on say it's a different story in Europe than it is in Africa, and I'll give an example of that. Equinor produces gas for 170 million people in Europe every day through pipelines. My brother to my right here will be able to say that Equinor is in direct competition with another very big gas supplier to Europe, which is Gazprom, and who also supplies, depending on the year, a similar amount of people with pipelines from Russia. Now, that means that 400 million people in Europe are served every day with natural gas through pipelines. That type of transition, which has then happened over 50, 60 years, it still is to be happening in Africa. So for me, the transition is actually more about more fossil fuels, it's about more renewables, and it's about more integration of the various economies and industrialization of many of the countries on this continent. So which brings me to, and my final point on this, is why I'm sitting here today. And why I'm now working for another type of company. It's a private company where we think that the opportunity space in Africa for investments into energy is probably, we agree with Larry Fink, who said it's probably the biggest arbitrage in a lifetime. So we are here to invest into the energy space on this continent because we believe the returns and the opportunity set within that space will be the best in this part of the world. So that's why I'm happy to be here, and that's why I'm looking forward to this engagement and also to talk to all of you afterwards. Thank you very much.
Right. My name is Chinan Dikwal. I head energy transition for KBR. Many of you will be very familiar with us. We are an EPC company based out of Houston. So, like my colleague here, I'm extremely excited to be here, to be talking about energy transition in the context of Africa. Now, there's no doubt that energy transition is a bit controversial on the African continent. Many people coming out of COP26 view the transition from the point of view of a threat to Africa's position as an energy supplier, a threat to Africa's position, Africa's revenue. Take the example of Nigeria, 90% dependency on oil proceeds. Take the example, many countries, right? Angola, about the same, and several. So there is a bit of a threat perspective there. But in my mind, when I think about the energy transition in the context of Africa, I think we have to wrap our heads around the opportunity that abounds as well. What I mean by this is, if Nigeria produces 1.8 million barrels, 1.6 you can argue, and Angola produces 1.3 million barrels, and 90% of that crude ends up in international markets, okay? The question there is, what's happening to those international markets? Many of them are dropping the pump, they are moving into EVs. That's a given. That is a given, you can't argue with that, okay? So a huge amount of the crude that we're selling is going to be turned into electrons. It's a controversial topic, I get it. But that contrary view, I'm going to put it out here, and you have to pardon me. I'm going to put out the contrary view here, okay? The pump is turning into electrons. That oil is going to be shaved. Look at what Woodmac is saying. Woodmac forecasts by 2050, global oil production moves from 100 million barrels, which is where we are today, to roughly 30 million barrels. Now, whether you agree with it or you don't, let's assume for the sake of argument that that could be right. Now, if that's right, then the question here is there's a 70% haircut. 100 million barrels, only 30. 70 million barrels is in the haircut. The question there is, who is in that haircut and who is in the 30%? Now, I can tell you for sure, the people who are likely in that 30 million barrels, okay, are people like Saudi Arabia, $5 per barrel production cost. Qatar, $6 per barrel production cost. Bahrain, Kuwait, you go on the curve across, sort of low-cost producers, then you start to come all the way into Europe, and then you merge into Africa, sort of low-cost like Ghana, who've been able to manage their costs. Some of the onshore plays in there, Nigeria high, Angola high, Venezuela high, the point I'm trying to make here is, at the end of the day, it would become a game of economics. Who's able to produce the cheapest oil in the day for them to stay in that 30%? And that's how Africa needs to think. We need to focus in two ways, perhaps thinking about cost efficiency. Can we drop our costs very aggressively, or can we look at the energy transition from a point of opportunity? If Germany is coming out and are saying very clearly, we will be a demand center for hydrogen. Africa has the best solar irradiation in the world. We should be at the forefront of trying to capitalize and take advantage of that. So I think there are a couple of things here. The energy transition is a huge opportunity, I think, for Africa, and we need to think about it very, very aggressively. Sorry, it's controversial, but I think we've got to put that thought out there.
This is what we're here for. We want to hear those thoughts. We certainly are not just looking at thoughts by the book. Certainly every opinion is welcome here. Good.
That was a very, very good intro there. So my name is Gerd Ng. I head Career Energy. Career Energy is a new kid in the block in the E&P space, independent. My background is petroleum engineering, chemical petroleum engineering, and I'm glad to be here as well, and I'll give you more reasons why. I have spent about 10 years of my 15 years in the oil industry with Shell, and you could see the way Shell and the majors do business. Mr. Eric Williams, who was the minister, he was former minister of energy in Trinidad and Tobago. He said the whole basis of the oil and gas industry is to make money. You have to be profitable. If you look at the way the likes of the majors, when they transitioned from the unconventionals, the heavy oils, to oil, to gas, it's all about making money. Now, I'm going to throw a different angle to my colleagues' here perspective. If you look at the forecast, the oil and gas forecast, for 20 of the top producers in the world, their forecast, which is published publicly, you will realize that there is a forecast of an increase in oil and gas production to 2040 and beyond. There is an increase in oil production and gas production to 2040 and beyond. Now, some of these countries have pledged to reduce their oil and gas production. But the difference is that for their own economic development and energy security, their forecast shows an increase in oil and gas production. However, what they pledge is a decrease in that forecasted oil and gas production still in order to meet their economic needs. What I'm saying is that if you look at the desired production of oil and gas in order to meet the Paris Agreement of 1.502 degrees, it should show a decline in production. So let me give the energy transition in my own point of view. The energy transition, in my own point of view, is when you begin to produce your oil and gas resources and you begin to have a natural decline, then you begin to translate, you begin to transition. Germany doesn't produce any oil and gas, very, very small. Their production of coal has declined. So it's obvious they have to transition. If you look at Norway, Norway produced to several hundred million barrels of oil, and the normal energy decline of the reservoirs shows that they should begin to think of an energy transition. So my point is that energy transition, and my colleagues have rightly said it here, should be a regional approach, or at best, a country approach. You begin to produce your own natural resources. When you begin to realize that you have a decline, then, of course, it's time for you to begin to transition into a newer or a different energy resource. Now, for Africa, of course, that's great news. If we look at the total gas in place in Africa, it's about 800 TCF. Saudi Arabia, I think, has the highest in place, about 1,000. The Middle East pretty much has the highest in place. So if you look at the opportunity in Africa, we still have lots of oil, so the reservoirs are still producing. They will still be able to produce for several years. We have lots of gas which is untapped, so that's why you see the likes of Qatar Gas and Chevron. They're going for the big gas reservoirs. So that is the transition for Africa, if at all, moving from high oil production or maintaining your oil production, or even as a matter of fact, optimizing your oil production bringing in more of the gas on stream, right? So if you look at it in terms of time scale, Africa still has at least 30, 40 years of oil and gas production. Thank you.
Let's move on to Vladimir.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Vladimir Ilyanin. I represent Gazprom. I work for Gazprom EP International BV. I run the strategy and new business development for Upstream outside of Russia. I enjoyed hearing my colleagues. It's probably going to be said that we are not going to have conflicting opinions. And as you know, Russia is a country of experiment. We tried one or two things in the 20th century. And since then, we take with a pinch of salt whatever comes from the West with religious zeal and not much proof. So when it comes to climate change, we do believe it's real. But when it deals with concrete actions, we want to take inventory and take scientific approach and as to what really needs to be done. There's the energy transition comes with the saying that there should be less investment in the oil and gas sector. We'll look at the value chain. We'll look at the upstream. There is still flaring. It needs to be curtailed. It can be monetized against the CO2 quotas. We looked at the transport systems, and we understand that the new pipelines that we've been building are significantly less harmful in terms of emissions, methane leaks, than the old ones that have been there for 30, 40 years. We look at the end users, industrial clusters, LNG factories. It comes better in new clusters. It's more efficient. So if anything, it looks like the oil and gas industry needs more investment to support the energy transition than other way around. And I think I fully agree with what Mr. Ng said, that energy transition would probably make us look more inwards and see what we can do locally, how we can ensure that there are stronger local national companies, stronger local players to be able to have the customer, the demand down on the ground for whatever solutions we are providing, and maybe rely less on the highest paying buyer somewhere in Tokyo or anywhere else, which was easy when oil was the thing.
Thank you, Vladimir. I think one thing which I'm hearing from all what you guys are saying is gas is likely to be the transition fuel for the next 20, 30 years, if that's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing we're moving or likely to move from oil into gas, and Vladimir is just talking about trying to use that gas to power the economy internally rather than looking at markets externally to sell, like has predominantly been the case with respect to crude. And my question is this: looking at how Gazprom has been able to develop infrastructure which links Russia to other European countries and to be able to commercialize that, what are you seeing that can be replicated in Africa? I mean, we have a free trade agreement which just come into play, but one of the biggest issues that we've always had around is investment in infrastructure. How are we able to sort of learn from what has happened? I'm happy His Excellency the Minister from Libya is here, and it's certainly some of the things which I'm sure he will be taking to his colleagues with respect to what we need to do to be able to get intra-African projects going, which are going to be able to enable leveraging of some of that gas across and beyond borders.
I think it's absolutely crucial that such intra-regional trade happens, and it's based on market drivers. There are centers that can produce energy in Africa cheaply, and there are centers that don't have that access. Unfortunately, it's the question of scale. Sometimes the scale is not affordable yet between the countries, and maybe there are solutions that are coming with the new technologies that would make things easier for the region. Maybe instead, well, we're big supporters of pipelines, and we believe that's, well, in a short distance, under 1,000 kilometers, pipeline is always more efficient than everything else. But if you talk about niche markets, if you talk about coastal cities in Africa, maybe the small-scale LNG, the ISO containers, the LNG carriers of smaller size could be the solution. We could see a booming LNG market along the coast of Africa very soon, but we don't see it yet. We hear a lot of requests for LNG regasification, but it's only beginning now. You talk about Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, but we've all heard this for the last 10, 15 years For how many years we hear about an LNG regasification terminal in South Africa? It just doesn't happen for whatever reason. So there needs to be a political will to be able to support it. There needs to be financing in place to be able to support it. Maybe it's not the way of going too big, but adequate to be able to capture the demand that exists today and build on it.
Thank you. Heiner, where you sit, I know you look at a whole bunch of transactions. And one of the things, of course, which always comes as, particularly for African countries, is, people say, yes, transition, but then how do we finance the transition? If at all, transition is going to be all about gas for a couple of years, and we're talking about infrastructure projects, including also transnational infrastructure projects. What are you seeing and what are you telling clients, some of your clients on the continent, with respect to new ways of financing this? I mean, oil is somewhat different with respect to gas in terms of, pre-contracts before one can even start projects. We've seen difficulties around getting gas projects going in some countries. So what can one do? What are the novel ways around financing which African countries need to be looking at, and also players internally?
Very good. I think, first of all, I have, in a way, just an expansion on basically the transition, because I think one thing is gas from a reservoir that is, a traditional oil and gas kind of concept. Yeah. But in addition, what you see in many parts of the world, which I think will be very interesting also in Africa, and where I want to go with this is to say maybe there is a way to bridge some of that demand, let's say loss of, or where demand isn't visible today, because you don't have a starting point. So it's a bit of a catch-22 where you don't develop the infrastructure because you don't have a demand, and you don't have a demand because you don't have infrastructure. So I want to expand a little bit on one point first, and that's there is biogas from all sorts of sources, for example from landfills and from biomass, etc. There is from waste, right? So energy from waste. And really, I believe that one way to, let's say, start small, to just have said that before I go into finance, is actually to do decentralized power solutions and decentralized energy solutions in many parts of the world. And Africa is probably particularly well suited for that, because you don't have the centralized system all over. So I think that's an area where there will be quite a bit of capital and innovation and interest from local and state and multilateral kind of organizations. Now, then moving into the financing, and I think this is the pardon the pun, the big elephant in the room. Yep. Is that when we're talking about the fact that the West is saying we cannot invest into oil and gas infrastructure anywhere, full stop, it basically means that financing dries up. That's what it means. So when they say energy transition, it means there is no financing. And I'm being over dramatic, but so in my world, I represent a private office, so financing is not the problem. Yeah. But because it's not a problem, the context is when I meet with banks, when I meet with multilaterals, and when I meet with oil companies, they say you're lucky because you can do these things, right? We're not talking about, this is completely viable projects, but there is a strategic point now in many banks, in many companies, where they just cannot invest into these projects. And if they do, they have to limit it in their portfolio. And where do they limit first? The places where it's more cumbersome. So to kind of land to try and answer your question, I think one way we will a hybrid financing we'll see going forward is where I think there will be more public-private partnerships in Africa, maybe with the national oil companies, maybe with the the government of a country in one way or the other, where you have to have an open book. You look at it together and you say, we realize that we can put some of the sovereign risk on this. There's private money coming in, and then we have a target, commercially. It's going to be run. This project is going to be run as a commercial project, and the end of that is really, that's the way we get projects rolling. Okay. And I think that also goes for infrastructure and energy, and that can be local private partnerships, but I think also there will be sprinkling of international, and that's why, again, back to why I'm here is exactly that. I think there is a opportunity space for private capital that will fill a bit of that void that will be left by the larger banks, etc., that cannot invest in it to the same degree.
Thanks. Chinan, over to you. Heiner was just talking about capital, which is one of the constraints, a big elephant in the room, like he called it. Another one is technology. And I know you sit with KBR and you have a view of a lot of the technology that is brought to drive transition in that sense. Africa, again, similar to capital, technology has been an issue in the past. What are you seeing? And we've always seen the story of leapfrogging on the telecom side, which happened in Africa and pretty much got Africa beyond a whole host of Western countries. Is there a possibility of seeing that in the gas space?
So I think that's a fascinating question, actually. And if you don't mind, I'll start off from financing again. I think if you ask me, in terms of energy transition, financing is probably the biggest thing, right? Because you're asking somebody to move away from the status quo into something new. The question is, how does he do that, right? Most of the times, companies would have to finance that off their balance sheet. You know, the money's not going to come from everywhere. We've seen COVID-19, government, did quantitative easing, printing money. I think in the US, up to $30 trillion was printed, right? The result of that today is hyperinflation. Sorry, pardon me to say, but it's true. Take the CPI, the numbers came out yesterday, 6%. Asset inflation, you look at real estate, 23%. So a huge amount of inflation is coming to the market. So QE is not the answer. Energy transition has to be financed off the balance sheets of, Equinor and Shell and BP. So that's where the challenge is. And we're telling these guys not to produce oil. We're telling them to move over, but then you move over to what? It has to be financed. So it's a chicken and egg situation. It leads back to the point that Hein was making here. That hybrid solution of government coming in and working very closely with these companies, creating the right incentives, the right platforms, for investment to happen. But to answer your question around technology, I think we're starting to see a huge explosion, a massive explosion in the technology space for energy transition. And it's across the board. It's around CO2 capture, direct air capture. It's around amine solutions. It's around, solar PVs, huge efficiency gains, wind power. It's around electrolyzers. Cost of electrolyzers has dropped significantly over the last few years. The trick for today is these technologies still have not reached price parity with CCGTs, combined cycle gas turbines. They're still much more expensive. Now, for you to drive the cost down further, it leans back to exactly what Vladimir was talking and Hein was saying, that we need to have economy of scale. These things need to be built up, massively ramped up for the price to drop, for them therefore to compete. So again, it's a chicken and egg situation. Many of the technologies are relatively proven. Amine systems of carbon capture, that's been with us for a long time. But the component of scaling them up to make sure that they become ubiquitous and therefore dropping price, I think that's still very far in to see. And if you pardon me to just comment about the question of, to Vladimir, just one thought here. You mentioned about infrastructure. We see Russia having sent that gas in. I was in a panel, I think this week, listening to Gabriel Obiang-Lima. And his thought process there was quite stark to see. I mean, he's driving for an Africa where it's not driven by one country making decisions for that country, but a hub concept. So think about the Ingadam project in Congo. You've got, Congo-Brazzaville, you've got DRC, you've got Gabon there. Is there a situation where that hydro project, massive as it is, could be developed for it to produce power, and then literally the off-takers are the other countries around it? So I think that sort of holistic thinking is what would drive real GDP growth. And you mentioned the free trade agreements. I think those are the catalysts for it.
Yeah. Gerd, if I go to you, I want to take a different view take this discussion somewhere else. One of the key things that we've seen with respect to IOCs and energy transition is this moving away from certain assets, so disposing of assets, basically. We've seen significant amount of disposals in Nigeria or in other countries, including Gabon, that is also an opportunity. And I know that there are a whole bunch of independents here, including yourselves, who are looking at some of those opportunities. So what are you seeing in terms of taking on some of these assets? And what do you think is going to happen to the market in the next, say, 10, 15, 20 years, where we're seeing, junior players, some of them solely African, looking for capital from non-traditional areas? What is the likely development in the market in that sense?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very, very interesting question, especially as an independent small E&P. But I'm going to get to that answer. I want to touch on what Vladimir and my colleague here mentioned with regards to the markets, because it is very important. See, Africa has always approached the energy from a country perspective, right? You have, let's take refineries, for instance. You have Cameroon has a little refinery, Gabon has one, Congo has one, right? And going back to what His Excellency Gabriel Lima was saying, if you look at the whole economics of having a refinery, for instance, in a country which does not have the demand, it doesn't even have the capacity to be able to meet the region, we have to start moving away from those heavily artificial barriers and move now into regional spaces. So for instance, we have the north, we have the west, we have the east, we have the south, and we have the central. If we can create economic regions, 5 economic regions, and have economic hubs in each of those regions, then it makes it easy, for instance, for Gazprom to come in and say, you know what, I'm going to target the Central African market, I'm going to target the South Space market, and with that, the West African market. Right, then in that case, you really have your demand and your supply intact. So I think I just want to touch base on that regards to how we can really approach the whole market space in Africa. Now, going to the assets which have been left behind by the likes of the IOCs. If we look at Nigeria, Nigeria has lots of oil, lots of gas, but they also have the talent. The petroleum bill which was passed in Nigeria has given a lot of opportunity, even prior to that bill. It gave a lot of opportunity to indigenous E&P companies in Nigeria, right? And they passed the indigenous bill where indigenous companies could actually go in and pick these assets. I think creating that opportunity, clearly, it gives an opportunity for little companies to go in there and begin to produce oil and gas. Now, the financing part also becomes tricky. And that is when you have to turn around and lean on the local banks, for instance, because you do not yet have the required credit rating to go to the major banks to ask for funding. I think that is going to be the challenge going forward. What we see is that the only way we can really penetrate some of these assets is hooking or merging or partnering with some of the bigger independent energy companies within Africa. For instance, in Nigeria, we are a partner with Atlas Petroleum. Now, Atlas Petroleum has been in production in the African space for a very, very long time. So they have the resources to be able to work with us to be able to produce some of the assets which some of the IOCs have left behind. So I think when it comes to financing, it's really going to be the tricky part, and that is where we have the national oil companies have a significant role because they have the required leverage to be able to support these little E&P companies, because at the end of the day, the revenue is for the country.
Thank you. Let's go back to Vladimir, and I just want to ask, since you are in charge of new business, I'll put you on the spot. Are you looking at gas projects in Africa?
We don't have that sizable presence yet in Africa. We're in Libya and in Algeria. In Libya, we're in production together with our partners in National Oil Company and Wintershall. And we're happy to say that the production is going up. We have been able to put in place the gas treatment plant for associated gas, and we hope the production will ramp up to the plant levels. In Algeria, we think of taking the FID on a gas project between now and the end of the year. We're looking at projects in sub-Saharan Africa, but in many cases, that has not been easy because of financing issues and the issue of the paying customer. We were present in Nigeria from 2008 to 2011, and I would say that the great things are happening in the country, but the PIB is probably 10 years late. And it's very sad to see that movement towards giving more to indigenous companies come in so late, because the banks are now beginning to squeeze the financing, and it's how is going to happen is a big question mark. The second project we had was in Namibia, next door, with development of Kudu field, and we couldn't put together a right project with NAMCOR and Eskom as the off-taker. So we are looking at different opportunities. We support some of the projects in Cameroon, for example.
Yeah.
Gazprom Marketing and Trading is a sole off-taker for, I think it's called Gili LNG plant that is run by Perenco.
Yep.
We look at different projects that exist. We especially like gas, and we like the project that will ensure that more gas is consumed locally, that connects the local gas reserves with local or regional demand. And we believe it's an interesting region to look at. There is hardly any other place there you have so much stranded reserves compared to anywhere in the world.
Thank you for that. That's music to our ears in terms of the opportunities in Africa. Heiner, I mean, we've been talking about oil, gas. Of course, renewables are a big part of transition and a big part of what people are saying to be the end goal. You know, what are your thoughts around that? Are you looking at renewable projects at the moment? Are you looking at them solely with soft money? Are you looking at them purely just from a commercial perspective? Are they driving deals? What are purchasing power agreements doing? Are they in a better state? Vladimir was just talking about that in terms of what you need to have in place before some of those projects can be driven. So what are your thoughts? What are you looking at in countries like Nigeria, Angola, or whatever?
Very good. So maybe one step back first in terms of the group. So we would look at anything where there is a good return. And we have, you know, we're the world's largest shipping company. So we have, you know, 350 large ships around the world, LNG, LPG, crude products, cars, cargo, you name it, we have it, mining, etc. Then, you know, we have a bank which actually supports a lot of Nigerian companies in getting finance in Europe so basically syndication of financing to Nigerian, but any producer in any place, but Africa is a particular region, because actually to Vladimir's point, it's not actually that easy for some of these companies to get financing elsewhere. So that's another one. We are looking at E&P projects across the board in Africa, particular focus on Africa on that. And again, coming back to the point, why? Because it's about returns. Then on the renewable sides, we think the market in general is overpriced on the renewables at the moment. We just announced where we will enter as an anchor investor into a large-scale wind park. I don't know how to explain this actually. The boats that you use to construct and to maintain the wind parks that are floating or in deep water. So it's a big company set up with basically the leading technology providers from the industry. So that's really a company we believe very strongly will be the market leader in that. So we'll do that. Why we do it? Because we think, first of all, we believe very strongly in management there, and we believe very strongly in the value proposition of that company. Okay. But we will not invest in wind parks because we think they're overpriced at the moment. But then I want to just have one more word on Africa. I think here is where the energy transition will be a very big opportunity for Africa, because there is the overpricing on projects. There is a lot of capital looking for projects in the energy, in the renewable space. That will trickle down into this continent for sure. So there will be, say, a very large level of those investments also coming into play here. But as I said, we are driven, sadly, but that's reality, by a strict commercial interest, and to build, industrial positions where we think we have an edge. And so that's more in the traditional energy side. But we will, of course, from time to time, when we strongly believe in the technology or the people, to go into renewables, for sure.
I don't think you should say sadly. Personally, I think if there is no particular commercial edge to it, then it's only a matter of time till the thing falls down. So I'm pro business, pro making money or whatever. So don't feel ashamed to make money. You're not in Norway here. We're okay with that. Don't feel ashamed to make money. Yes, Chinan, one of the things which has driven the industry, or which has been a key bone of contention in the oil industry, and then possibly it's going to be the same in the gas industry, particularly in Africa, has been around local content. And now we're moving into transition. I'm sure some of what were realities and were needed for those industries is not necessarily the same thing, for the new emerging industry. We're talking hydrogen, and we're talking, solar, wind, or whatever. What do we need to be looking, what do African regulators need to be looking at and doing in terms of retooling their local content, local legislation to actually impact and boost some of this? Because we would certainly not be able to leapfrog and operate using legislature and rules that applied to, oil markets in the 60s or the 70s to the technologies of the future.
That's a great question. I think you have lots of answers there as well, Verner. But I was going to say exactly so. If you ask me, I think the most important component of the energy transition is the human capital. The financial capital and the technology, I think those are shaping. I think the raw human capital, the people who would operate these plants and make it happen, is a big thing that many people are not talking about. And it's not just in Africa, even in Europe, it's a massive thing. Now, you go onto LinkedIn right now, half of the people have changed their titles to energy transition. That's just on LinkedIn, right? The real core of it is, can we get the job done? So I think that's a huge gap that we'd have to address, which goes back to the same point that we talk. So coming after COP26, we're still talking about 1.5 degrees C, and within a very aggressive time frame of 2030. I honestly think that will be missed. And the reason for that is all the things we spoke about: financing, technology, human capital. All of these things have not aligned, and they all need to align in a beautiful way for us to hit 1.5 degrees C. But I think from sort of an African standpoint, in terms of legislation and what's required, when we think about even if you put energy transition aside, I think for Africa, the way that Africa needs to think is what's happening in Libya, very much so, it's what's happening in Algeria, that centralized, so I'm talking power here, centralized energy generation, centralized power generation, like we're finding here in South Africa, starting to become obsolete because the infrastructure is quite old, unfortunately. In fact, it's quite funny, but in Europe, transmission losses are about 10% of total production. In Africa, they're about 40%. So just to put that in context, you put 100 electrons at the start of it. When it comes off the other way, you only have, you put 100, you only have 60. So it's a colossal thing. So we need to start to think of moving away from centralized. The answer here, and it's not energy transition, this is simply technology. Instead of having a school that's waiting for power to come from the grid or a hotel like this, the answer here, literally, if you ask me, is having production right here on site and consumption at site. It could be a solar facility with a battery or something of that sort. We need to start to think like that. Now, the question is there price parity? There's no price parity right now. It's still quite expensive. But perhaps that's where government can come in and take advantage of that delta. Come up with strategies that shave off that delta and enable this to happen. And if that happens, much of the power issues we're having in the country will be eradicated.
Okay, I think I'll go to a last and final question to Gert, then we'll have a...
Can I comment on the local content part?
You certainly can.
Yeah.
I'm just going to ask you a question, and then I'm going to allow everybody to have a final note, and then we'll move to questions to our audience, which has been made. And my final question to you, Gert, is we've heard about difficulties of raising finance, including for IOCs, major IOCs, to be able to tackle some of the projects which we see, and a lot of IOCs are looking at own balance sheet financing to be able to drive certain stuff. I presume that must also be a challenge, a significant challenge for smaller independents like yourself, and it would be interesting to listen to some of the novel things that you guys are doing to be able to tap into financing to be able to move some of these projects further.
Thanks. So I'm going to answer that part first and then try to piggyback on the local content aspect of it. So one of the things which is important in business, of course, is how you can raise capital. So we talk about human capital, talk about financial capital. If you look at the demand for oil and gas in the world, you have India and China with the biggest, in terms of population and the highest demand when it comes to oil and gas. And then Europe, of course, is being supplied by Russia predominantly, and some from Africa. You begin to realize that the opportunity, if you want to go for about smart financing, is to try to target those big economies which really need the oil and gas. So one of the things which, of course, we're doing is we're going after Chinese and Indian companies because they need the oil and gas, right? Because in that way, we have secured offtake agreements, we have secured transportation, in case of the vessels required, because they can pretty much invest capital for us to be able to do those offshore operations. So that is kind of our own novel approach in order to get financing. We try to go after the markets which need our products and say, you need it, join us so that we can produce it. Okay. Right, so I think, other companies could try that approach, but it is working for us so far. Nonetheless, we are also trying to get capital from within the country. Right, because if you begin to look at a small field which could give you 5,000 barrels, there are lots of very wealthy and rich Africans who can, get into oil and gas space. Because I think we're also missing that aspect of it. And simply because maybe they do not really understand the economics of oil and gas. There are so many wealthy Africans who can actually invest in oil and gas. So that's also an approach which we're trying to take. If I can comment on the local content aspect.
Certainly, and just a final comment.
Okay. Yeah, I think there is a little, not misconception, but something is missed when it comes to local content. When the IOCs come and do work, and even some of the majors, they would, of course, guarantee employment. But employment is not enough, right? You need to be able to develop the people you've employed. If you have been privileged to work for some of the majors, some of the big companies, when you walk in, you have a development plan. In 3 years, you're going to transition to this role. In 5 years, you transition to this role. I think it is important for African governments to ensure that a good development plan is in place for future hires. And the other important thing is the integration of the small and medium-sized companies. Because when we look at IOCs coming and exiting, you will still have employees who have been developed, but if you do not have the small and medium-sized enterprises, which can also partake along the value chain, then you totally miss out on that expertise which is required to transition into any other industry. So I think it is important that the policies in place give room for smaller companies to come in and do some of these services and not just rely on the IOCs and the majors to do all the work. So I think that's another important aspect of local content. The final thing about that is if we look at Nigeria, for instance, Nigeria has, I think they're going up for the 7th LNG train. Yep. What that tells us is that there is huge expertise when it comes to LNG in Nigeria. Mozambique, Senegal, which are looking at gas projects, why not send your staff, or why not send people from those respective countries to go and get trained in Nigeria? Without having to rely on bringing expertise from across the borders or from the different continents. I think that regional approach in skill development is very, very important. His Excellency Lima also mentioned yesterday about the fact that they have the Technical Institute. It is important for African countries to ensure that they have the required vocational training institutes so that they can always be ready for any eventual energy transition. And again, I do not believe we're moving out of oil and gas. We still have a very, very long way. But it is important that we begin to develop the skills required, especially for minerals, rare earth minerals.
Final thoughts and comments, Chinan?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think the energy transition is certainly where Africa is right now. There's an opportunity for us to come out of energy poverty, I think, particularly using solar and all the things around us. But I also think that Europe is hydrogen thirsty, no question about that. They've said it, it's quite clear. And we have great solar irradiation, we have wind. I think that's a given. So we can take advantage of all of these and, feed those markets in there.
Okay.
Let me take a little bit different approach to that. When I spent 4 years in Nigeria, and I always ask everyone I meet now that I live in the UK, how many generators, diesel generators do they think there is in Nigeria? And I give the number of people that live in Nigeria, and I say, how many generators do you think it is? The lowest number I've gotten is 100. And it's 50 million generators. And I say, that is so it's not, it's obviously energy poverty, but at the other end there is a willingness to pay for energy that is phenomenally high, right? Because it's a small generator, you need to keep it yourself. The number of times I've sit with my staff talking about how you maintain a generator and what quality generator is good and not is countless, right? So that was Nigeria. Now in Norway and in the UK and in Europe, there is what they call an energy crisis, right? So now they're finally paying what Nigerians are paying every day for power. For a month, they've done that. Now there is newspaper article every single day in the Norwegian newspaper about cutting the power lines that goes to Germany, Denmark, France, UK, etc., because Norwegians have to pay more for power, right? We export the power, we make money on that, right, as a country. In the UK, they're talking about the same. It's throwing out the government, and it's absolutely insane that we haven't developed X, Y, Z, etc. That's a month of paying what Nigerians accept every day. I think that is the case all over Africa. That people are accepting and paying an enormous amount of money for what in the rest of the world is considered something they don't even worry about. In principle, they have to pay a bill, a utility bill once a month, absolutely. But when they then see what happens at the region, it's easy to talk high thoughts when you're not hungry, as it were. But then you see people paying this amount. That the language used and the thoughts that are being spawned from that 1 month is something we should really take into consideration and really work hard to solve the energy problem or energy transition, call it whatever we want, but that we need more energy in this continent for the stability of this continent. Thank you.
Final thoughts, Vladimir?
I think I would echo everybody that it's wrong to say that we have a choice between energy access and energy transition. Energy access comes first. I think that it was Winston Churchill who said the politician is the person who will tell you exactly what's going to happen convincingly, and then in the same convincing manner will tell you exactly why it didn't happen. We've passed on Millennium Goals, Sustainable Development Goals. We are creating new goals. We haven't achieved the previous ones. Henk is right. The price of electricity in West Africa, the real price, effective, is several times higher than anywhere in Europe. And tackling the energy poverty is probably first and foremost task. Creating a market that can create jobs for the people, can be meaningful, can take care of the environment, is the ultimate task. Then we can talk about energy transition. And when we do it, we have to think about what exactly we want to achieve. How do we get to this 1.5 degrees Celsius descent? There are easier ways. I was in the presentation by Sonangol in the morning. The guys are doing a great job. Deforestation, the mangroves, these are things that matter. They capture significant amount of CO2 that you don't have to come up with something very expensive like direct air capture. There are trees that you can put out there that will help you, and you know that they will help not only the global air, but also the communities on the ground in the future. So I think there are easier ways to be in line with the energy transition targets without trampling on the previous promises, without defaulting on them, and ensuring that energy poverty is a history, and that the SDG number 7, access to efficient and cleaner energy, is truly achieved.
Thank you to the panel. We'll now move to the audience for questions. So please put up your hands if you have any questions. Yes, I can see a gentleman there at the back. Please, if you can stand up so people can see you and say your name and your organization and then ask your question. Thank you.
Adrian Stradum, South African Oil and Gas Alliance. Question, basically, I like what I heard about regional approach and development plan. I think that's fantastic. But the question is, who funds that plan? And is there room for a collaborative approach, consortium approach, where there's a partnership that looks, government, industry, looks at that, developing that plan, and then collaboratively fund that? Thanks.
So thanks for your question. Regarding the regional approach, there was a gentleman yesterday during the ministers' discussion in Avenue Hall. He mentioned that when oil price significantly dropped in 2008, so about $24, $25 a barrel, and then within a year it went up to about $80 a barrel and then to 100. We had the same scenario in 2016 when it dropped. I think we had negative oil price at one point, and then we are now at 85. Most national oil companies were still producing oil. They didn't shut their operations. So if you look at the balance sheets for most national oil companies, it made a lot of money. And the advocate here is that there is money. These national oil companies have money. Right, so I think it is, and I think one of my colleagues also mentioned here, it's all about transparency and good governance. If these companies can really sit on the table and craft that regional approach, they can make it work. It's really a matter of honesty, transparency, and good governance. Right, in my own world, I think what Africa needs to do is have these 5 regions and get representatives from each of these regions and lock them up in a room like as if they would play a chess game. And so you guys go figure it out, have a strategy. And you know, it should initially come from each region. So each region will most probably have 10, 15 countries, and you have your own regional plan. Do the same thing. Go in there like you want to play a chess game and really strategize and not send the politicians. Because I think that is what we really miss in Africa. The resources are there, the talent is there. It's just a matter of transparency and good governance. I think that'll be able to solve the problem.
Yeah. I think that's a fascinating question, you know, and the reason for that is I think there are several mechanisms that you can use to arrive at the solution you're describing there. An example is just last week we had I think it was about 6.8 billion that the EU, the UK, Germany, France put in with the South African government. So 6.8 billion to help the South African government to decarbonize. I mean, it's all over the place. You also have, if you look at Northern Cape, the Northern Cape government working with Sasol, you know, in Bogobai, I think it's in Bogobai, you know, a huge hub development for hydrogen. So the point I'm trying to make here is there are several of these initiatives that are happening. But to his point, I think what will make it more potent is if we combine all of these into one and create something that, you know, can pull on several synergies. I think that's the way to go. The way not to go is this quantitative easing, where every government is printing money, you know, just printing money and dumping it into renewable, and, you know, the price of everything is going up. I think that's the wrong approach. You know, we need to start to think about what's the synergy? Can I pull this project and that project together? You know, 1 + 1 = 3. That's sort of the philosophy.
Just very quickly on that, I think one way is a structured approach. Another one is maybe the opposite. And I think the example could be, for example, take Rotterdam Port, which is, if it's not world's largest, it's definitely Europe's largest container port. And they also import all sorts of other stuff. There was no agreement between those 20, 30 countries in Europe that Rotterdam would be that place. It just happened. Someone took that, and it's an obvious place for a port, so it's not a bad idea. But that, you know, some of it is playing to your strength and going all in on that, right? And one question, for example, could be, and just a leading question, to move it away a little bit from energy, where is the international hub for airport in Africa? Or where is that international port? Right, where you put, and that's a local, it's a one national government decision to do that, to put those, let's say, frameworks in place for it. That's not something you need, global or regional agreement on. It helps to have good neighbors that thinks it's a great idea, but I think I would just advocate it's both. I think if everything is going to be very complex and very kind of convoluted, then a lot of people will, or a lot of opportunities will be lost. And so I think it's about both.
Yeah, I would agree 100% that long-term planning is critical to success of any energy initiative in this region in particular. Unlike certain countries, here projects compete for the money, not the other way around with quantitative eases where money is chasing projects. So you have to pick ones that will really matter, deliver the most in terms of multiplier effect for the economy. And I do believe it's the government and national companies that have the primary responsibility for the long-term planning, and then everything else.
Another question? Any other questions? Yes? Gentleman behind there.
Thank you. Tabenyang Echu, University of Delaware, Energy Policy. My question is, I think we've been talking about a lot of integration, but I have attended most of the sessions so far. What is the role of African Union in all of this? Are we working in silos? Because if you talk about Europe, you talk about European Union, and they are coordinating as a bloc. If you talk about the OECD, they are working as a bloc. What is the role of the continental organization in this whole talk about energy transition? Thank you.
I think I'll pass the microphone to my friends, but I think we have discussed it yesterday shortly that in the region, there are 5 very distinct regions on the continent, on the African continent, which have different dynamics in terms of access to energy, resources that are available there. So it makes more sense to integrate firstly within those 5 regional organizations and then to move to the continent-wide solutions.
Yeah, no, just a very quick take from my side. I think it's good to have. I mean, even in let's say a European context, I think it's limited for the majority of that development. EU had a limited role. Now it's more about streamlining and having standards on the back of it. But there are so many. Take another region altogether in Latin America. There is very little integration there as well. Right, and they have their international multilateral organizations, etc., etc. But I mean, for example, there is still no road between Panama and Colombia. I mean, they were one country for a number of years, and they're next to each other and both quite wealthy countries. There is zero way you can move by land from one country to the other on that continent. But that isn't. I would just maybe argue it's not necessarily an hindrance for growth. So I would again maybe just say keep it as simple as possible and get on with it, and then it's either regional or country level. Because I'll just throw it out there, I think one of the reasons why this doesn't happen is because the transparency or the best project isn't maybe the one winning. The best project isn't the one being backed. And then when that happens over and over and over again over time, well, on an accumulated level, you end up at a lower level. So I would maybe keep it as simple as possible, and then leave the multinational or the multilaterals out of it to the degree possible.
Just 1 second. I wanted to ask if His Excellency, the Minister from Libya, has maybe something or a comment to say, because we're talking here and asking ourselves if at all there is a role for the African Union with respect to energy transition, all of this, and might be you have something to say, Excellency.
Okay. Good afternoon. Good morning. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your input. I was going to ask a question, so I'll ask the question first, then I will comment myself. My question is, would there be enough technology advancement and strong political will to lead the transition period so that we will not go to much hiccups and poverty. And you know, for example, now Africa is still in the 21st century, 600 people without electricity. So if we add to this another problem, we may get into worse situation than we intend to do. Secondly, on the African Union, I feel that he should take the lead and advance the projects in Africa and have probably try to have a common network for the gas that could be utilized currently for the natural gas, and in the future we could use it for the hydrogen. My judgment is Africa is located in a very convenient place to be in the southern part of the Mediterranean Sea and to be on the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans that can approach and reach different continents in the world. So I believe, I still think strongly that the African Union should play a leading role in this transition period. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay. If there are no questions, then I would say thank you very much to my panel for what I thought was a very interesting and detailed conversation. And thank you very much to my audience for being a wonderful audience and allowing the panel to do what it did really well. And I hope you continue to enjoy the conference. Yep. Let's thank you. Let's give them a round of applause, please.